The Tack Shooter has the potential to be the most satisfying Paragon in BTD6. If I was to make a list of which towers are the most satisfying to give as many buffs as possible to, the Tack Shooter would be at the top of that list. Even if I was just ranking the individual upgrade paths, both the Tack Zone and Inferno Ring would be among the top ones. The thought of a Tack Paragon, which takes the features of the Tack Shooter and amps up their power, is so awesome to me. In fact, I have 2 working ideas for the Tack Paragon. That's how hyped I am. My working name for it is the Infernal Maelstrom, the epicenter of balloon annihilation. The reason I think this Paragon will be so satisfying is because it can deal so much damage when it's placed as close to balloons as possible. So I think that for any Tack Paragon design, the priority is for it to deal huge damage to the balloons close to it. But how do you do that without sacrificing either the top or bottom path? The top path Ring of Fire is too iconic to not use, but the bottom path's sheer army of projectiles is just as iconic. Personally, I could take or leave the Meteor from Inferno Ring. I just want the Ring of Fire and the Tack Zone the most. That being said, between the two, I would much prefer the Tack Zone to be kept. That tier 5 has the best damage to Moabs because of how many ticks of damage it deals at once when placed well. The closer it is to the track, the more tacks that can hit a blimp at once. While it would be nice to have both, I don't think Paragons should feel like all of the tier 5s stacked on top of each other at once. They should feel like their own tower upgrade, just with significant representation of the most iconic parts of their parent tower. Luckily though, I have a way to incorporate the Tack Zone aspect of the Paragon without sacrificing the iconic Ring of Fire. Little old idea having me cooked up this extra effect for a Ring of Fire. Give the Paragon a Ring of Fire attack with pretty good range, at least for a Tack Shooter. It should still be the shortest range Paragon of course, but the point of it having some range at all is so that the bottom path can be incorporated into the Ring of Fire. My idea is to have the Ring of Fire deal more damage the closer the balloons are to the center. In other words, at the very edge of its range, it deals its normal damage, which is still very high. In the middle of its range, it deals noticeably more damage per tick. And when balloons are at the very center of its range, the Infernal Maelstrom deals the most damage per tick. I think this would be really satisfying and incorporate the same strategic placement that the Tack Zone encourages. Players would get to watch the Paragon deal more and more damage per second as bosses got further and further into its range. Once they reach the part of the track that the Paragon is right underneath, which would be the closest to the center, the DPS reaches its peak. It would be so satisfying to see the boss's health bar accelerate down to 0. This would be a way to balance the Paragon a lot more easily. If the damage is divided into very thin rings around the Paragon, it bypasses the need to balance the damage around each individual attack projectile. Otherwise, a single attack would be too strong on its own due to the boss damage scaling, making it insane to use it like a normal Tack Zone. Instead, each partition of the Ring of Fire could do a great amount of damage that gets better and better at closer range without becoming out of hand. Unfortunately, this does leave out the massive quantities of tact that some people might have been hoping for in a Paragon, and that's understandable. But at the same time, the less projectiles, the better the game's performance. I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice to make in order to help the Paragon be balanced and less laggy, all while still maintaining the most satisfying aspect of the bottom path and not leaving out the top path. But where does the middle path come in? There are a couple of ways to do this. One is to rip off the Sun Temple by shooting a spread of blades every once in a while. I'm not a fan of this method because it doesn't feel special enough. The second option is to give the Paragon an ability. I've shared before that I think activated abilities should be reserved for special cases. I think the Tack Shooter is one such case. Otherwise, the only consideration for this Paragon would be the placement. But that's only a consideration you make once, then leave the Paragon be for the rest of the game. Instead, an activated ability to help boost damage further could help make this Paragon a lot more interesting to use. Just how interesting can you make a Maelstrom ability though? Of course, you can always just copy and paste the actual Maelstrom ability. That would synergize with the extra damage dealt by placing it close to the track. You'd want to go against the grain and try to hit the boss with as many blades as possible once activated. But that's a bit too simple. You would just use this skill instantly when the boss spawns if you're placing the Paragon optimally. I want to give it an ability that makes players think about how to use it best. I have 2 ideas for 2 completely different mechanics. The first is to make players think carefully before using the ability because they have to be sure that it will deal all of its damage. That's because once the ability is done, the Paragon won't be able to attack again for a while. Sort of like it's cooling down after unleashing all of those projectiles. Players who want a good ranked time would have to be certain that the boss will pop after the ability is used, or else they'll be left without a significant damage dealer. You'd want to get the most of the DPS from the Paragon, but also use the ability during the highest DPS phase, since that would land the most projectiles on the boss. This would also help give the ability an excuse to be a lot more powerful, because this downside would be a way that weakens the ability. This would get tricky on any bosses who have enough HP to survive the full ability. You'd have to time it just right to finish off the boss. But I was thinking of adding another layer to this. This is the second of my 2 ideas for how to execute the Paragon. I have a feeling that a lot of people really like the Inferno Ring Meteor. It's actually what makes me like the Inferno Ring as a tower so much, because buffing its Pierce is so satisfying. The reason I didn't care to include the Meteor in the base attack was because I think it would work better as an ability. Imagine that the ability sent out a maelstrom of meteors instead of blades. In case anyone will miss the blades, sorry, but I think you might be in the minority. I believe that most people would find the meteors much cooler, but feel free to prove me wrong. I think it would keep consistent with the Ring of Fire attacks of the Paragon to also have a fiery ability. As long as they function similarly to the other tier 5s, the tower can feel like a real Paragon of the Tack Shooter without having to be a 555 tower explicitly. Now, should the meteors have tracking abilities? I say yes. For one, it would give a reason to add a targeting option to the Paragon, but also, it means the Paragon has a way to deal damage to bosses even outside of its range. This is important because it makes it a viable option against bosses like Lich and Vortex. You can use the Tack's Meteor ability to hit the boss early on, breaking a skull, and if you timed it right, the boss can be in range of the Paragon by the time the next skull is vulnerable, and maybe by the 3rd skull, it can be hit by the ability again. Or you can space out its ability between other abilities like the Mega Sentries and Ace Bombing Run. However you use it in game, it at least gives you something to do with the Paragon besides just placing it and watching it deal damage. The meteors should be slow moving so that it's difficult but rewarding to time it right, another excuse to make them stronger. You don't want to use the ability and then have Vortex's shield up by the time they reach it, or have Lich be invulnerable by the time they get to the boss. Again, going back to the first of my 2 ideas for the ability, if using the ability left the Paragon unable to attack for a brief time period, you would also want to time it so that the boss is invulnerable while the Tack can't shoot. That way, there isn't any potential damage being wasted during this period. All of these little things add up a lot when it comes to microing the Infernal Maelstrom. Even if you use the ability right on top of the boss, the meteors would have to curve back around to hit the boss again, which could actually make the ability worse for burst damage than if it was used from far away. So then it becomes a decision of where to place the Tack to prioritize whichever method of dealing damage is faster. Casual players can just ignore this and let the Paragon deal a satisfying amount of damage up close. Meanwhile, ranked tryhards can experiment with and see which positions for the Paragon are the best on each map with each new rule set. It should also be more fun to get a high degree on the Tack Shooter, since Tacks are usually the most effective defense to avoid penalties. Instead of selling them and letting those pops earned go to waste, you can put them to good use as sacrifices for the Paragon. It might even make you consider losing some eco by keeping a Tack zone rather than selling it, because of how many pops it earned during the boss battle. It would be cool to have a tower that's already meta for boss battles get a Paragon. However, this poses a pretty big threat to the Paragon meta. Assuming the damage output of the Tack Paragon is actually good enough to be worth getting in spite of its short range, it will probably be one of the most meta choices for killing bosses as fast as possible, up there with the Master Builder and Goliath Doomship. Based on the prices of its 3 upgrade paths, the Tack Shooter actually has a cheaper total cost than the Dart and Boomerang, but I don't think that should indicate a cheaper Paragon too. The Infernal Maelstrom seems much more like a 500k Paragon, at least, maybe even the most expensive one yet. Depending on which ideas get carried over to the actual Paragon, the price will have to reflect that. So it's something that we'll just have to wait for and see. I've gotten a pretty decent number of requests for Paragons, but it turns out that the village won the votes. So I'm going to be sharing my ideas for the village Paragon next. Expect that video to be a lot more elaborate than the rest so far. Let me know what Paragon you want to see next after that. I'll get to them all eventually, but since I'm going one by one, I want to go in order of what people are most interested in.